I have a unusual man crush on this person.
And likewise.
The details of our bromance require some form of NDA, but Gene is one of the most enthusiastic and intoxicating and positive people in our entire tribe. I don't know where it comes from, but I'm really glad that we have it. And Gene really was one of the products of the hit maker known as Purdue University and Gene Spafford. Whereas an undergrad, he developed Tripwire, which is a staple in most environments. And as a CTO of Tripwire, he left the echo chamber of security and really studied IT performers, high performers, and who does a good job at IT and why. And I never really understood what that had to do with security, but it turns out it has everything to do with security. And then that wasn't enough, so he decided to become a pioneer of the DevOps movement. Not a security person bludgeoning them saying how stupid they are, but a pioneer of DevOps where he's truly respected in that topic. And as such, instead of lamenting all the ways in which DevOps and that velocity of IT ruins security, he's injecting security patterns and security culture before the cement is dried. So as one of the members of our Gene pool, it's my honor and privilege to give you, Gene Kim, a true boundary spanner, one of which we should model ourselves after.
Thank you. Go wrong. Let's pull harder. All right, great. Hey, thank you so much. I'm going to speak to you today about an area of passion of mine that's been an area of passion for mine for about 14 years now, which is studying a group of organizations that back in 1999 we called geniuses of people with great kung fu. So these are people who talk differently, acted differently, but most importantly they had profoundly different results than your typical IT organization. So, and one of the biggest surprises is that it took me straight into the heart of the DevOps movement. So before I go into the DevOps, why I think DevOps is so important, especially us as a security community, I just actually want to tell you just a little bit about these high performers. Back in 1999, what we found was that these people who were leading these high-performing IT organizations, they typically came from one of three backgrounds. They were either a non-commissioned officer in the military, typically an E5 or an E6, right, independent armed service. They're a chemical engineer, or they were an auditor, right? Not just a green, eye shade wearing, bean counting CPA, they were an IT auditor, right? So can anyone sort of hypothesize or speculate what these three professions have in common? Non-commissioned officers in the military, chemical engineers, and auditors. Yeah. Rules, like it? Keep going. More other words that come to mind or values that these professions share? Yes. Discipline. Oh, I love it. Any other words come to mind? The words that we came up were rigor and discipline, right? So non-commissioned officers in the military, they gave live ammunition to 18-year-olds. What I've learned in my journey is that in restaurant operations, they don't even give knives to 18-year-olds because you combine, raw carrots and knives, right? You get accident rates that are so high, the insurance companies get involved. Chemical engineers, they have long, elaborate recipes that if you missequence 2 steps, endothermic can become exothermic and people can lose fingers, right? And then auditors, they haven't met a checklist or control that they haven't ever loved, right? So, any questions on that? In fact, in my journey, I helped raise about $1 million through a nonprofit, and our goal is to really link controls with performance. We found that rigor and discipline actually can predict about 60% of performance. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that went into a book that we call the Ops Handbook that we wrote in 2004, which our goal was really to sort of capture the good to great transformations of how these great operations and security organizations work together to achieve a bigger, greater goal. So, but in 2007, I started noticing something that I found very disturbing. The reason why I thought it was very important was that it happens in every IT organization. There's a downward spiral that seems to happen in every IT organization, regardless of the size of the company, what vertical, profit or not for profit. And so let me just share with you, because it can be told in 2 acts. Right? The first act always begins in operations. How many people here have done time as a sysadmin? Sometime, right? Okay, so if I were to plant allegiance, it certainly would be information security, but it's also operations, right? So in operations, we're often put in a position where we have to maintain reliable service, even for things that are run on fragile infrastructure or fragile code, right? And the reason we call it fragile is that you make a change to it, it breaks, right? You even look at it wrong, it breaks, and it causes a catastrophic outage, and no one knows how to make a new one, right? And there's a terrible sort of irony is that the most fragile artifacts typically tend to underpin the most important business initiatives for the company, or the ones that run the most critical business operations, right? And so when that happens, right, the organization typically misses the commitments it makes to the outside world, right? In other words, whether it's to a customer, whether it's to Wall Street, whether it's to analysts, right? So when the business or when the organization misses a commitment it makes to the outside world, right? Part of human nature is that we typically try to compensate for it by making even bigger, more audacious promises, right? And I guess that's fine and good, but the problem is that those commitments are often made by these people, right? Product managers who often don't have the best understanding of what technology can and can't do. Is this on? Is this right? And I'm not saying that product managers are bad, right? We're often creative writing majors, poetry majors, right? But they're often making decisions without the best understanding of what can and can't be done. And so thus we enter the developers, right? And so just to explain this picture. I'm a former developer, right? We have a joke in operations, right? Is that show me a developer who isn't causing an outage, and I'll show you one who is on vacation, right? So what the developers now see are urgent, date-driven projects put into the queue, right? Because a commitment has already been made to the outside world, right? And now developers have to focus only on features. They start cutting every corner they can to make the date. By the way, does this resonate with anyone here? How many people here has a friend that's gone through something like this? Yes? Okay. Right, so when developers take shortcuts, they use up all the time in the schedule, leaving no time for the people downstream, right? It's like capacity testing, load testing, QA, information security, deployability, right? And so what happens is that, at the end of the project, you have one more fragile artifact in production, right? And so, what they call this is technical debt, right? And so when I visualize technical debt, I kind of envision something like this, right? This, although bad, right, is not as bad as what it turns into, right? Because technical debt, like financial debt, compounds. So this eventually turns into this, right? So imagine that you have an outage, right? And it's due to a cabling error, right? And you even know that it's due to a cabling error between the SAN and the database, right? So which cable is it, right? Kind of tough, but by the way, it's that one, right? So, that is a downward spiral, right? It's a positively reinforcing feedback loop because, the more technical debt you have, right, the less time you have to actually pay down technical debt. But there's actually even a more insidious downward spiral that happens, and it sounds like this. We all have been a part of an application where it used to take 5 minutes to deploy, right? But then it takes an hour, takes 3 hours, takes a day, takes 2 days, right? But that's okay because those ops guys can actually finish the deployment over the weekend without impacting the customer, right? But when it takes 3 days, now we have a problem, right? It takes a week, takes 2 weeks, right? And suddenly I've actually seen an application that took 6 weeks to deploy with 1,300 discrete manual steps, right? And so when this happens, right, the deployment becomes so painful, right, that everyone in the organization says, let's do it less frequently. So the deployment intervals increase, right? Now, when that happens, right, no one is achieving their goals, right? We're all arguing about what feature we'll get in the year 2018, right? So when that happens, this is what causes the intertribal warfare between ops and development, right? So here's a developer who says, I checked my code, right? They committed to source control, they go home, high-five each other in the parking lot, not realizing that they set the entire data center on fire, right? And so when this happens, right, features aren't getting delivered, right? They're stuck somewhere between development and operations. Service levels are going down, right? And operations is spending more and more time firefighting. And let's not forget about us, right? Information security, right? By the time we get here, right, the buffet table is empty, right? There are no cycles left over, right? And we're now spending the majority of our time on the least nutritional type of work, compliance work, right? Where all the work we're doing is only for one person. That's the auditors or the regulators. And this is what causes us, especially us downstream, whether it's InfoSec or our brethren in IT operations, we feel caught in a system that preordains failure, right? We feel powerless to change outcomes, right? And we feel like no matter what we do, right, we are powerless, to avoid the failure that we can see coming. How many people here can resonate with this, at least a little bit, right? It's interesting to me, Jack Daniel and Josh Corman, they did a study on burnout in the information security industry. And when I saw the findings, it really was startling to me. They found that information security had a higher rate of burnout than first responders, right? People who were doing multiple tours of duty in the military, people, it was up there in the high, it was definitely in the red zone. And I think my informal studies have shown that IT operations also would be down here. And I think the reason is that whenever we're stuck downstream and having to live with decisions made upstream, right, that preordained failure, that's what causes burnout. And the three signs of burnout are cynicism, right? As Josh Corman says, cynicism is our core competency, fatigue, and illusions of self-efficacy, right? We think we're actually better than we are, right? So it doesn't have to be this way, right? So this downward spiral happens everywhere. And I think the reason why, right, with some reflection is that every IT organization, just by the way we're designed, almost preordains this, right? Every organization, IT organization, has to respond quickly to urgent business needs, right? Which is often embodied in the VP of development, the head of development, which means make features, ship features as fast as we can. But on the other hand, we have to provide reliable, stable, and secure IT service, right? Is often embodied by the operations person, right? And what they'll say would be make no changes ever over my dead body. And what I've found over the years is that can quickly be arranged, right? Because time to market will always trump stability, security, availability, and so forth, right? And so the reason why this happens everywhere, I think these numbers bear this out, right, is that every organization is an IT company, regardless of what business they think they're in, right? Because 95% of all capital projects have an IT component, right? And 50%, in other words, it's almost impossible to make a business decision without resulting in at least one IT change. Secondly, 50% of all capital spending is technology related. So for any business executive to say that IT is not a core competency, I think it is just the pinnacle of self-delusion. It is important. I think the visceral proof point is, whenever someone says in the business, we are here, and here's where we need to be, right, who's in the way? IT, right? Somehow we've constipated the flow of work, right? And usually, if you want to drill down even further, it's usually IT operations. And I think that's probably one of the best sort of evidence points of just how critical IT is. IT is not only the nervous system of the company, but it's also the majority of the muscle mass. So there must be a better way, and that takes us into Act 3. So, the reason why I think DevOps is so important is that the DevOps practitioners have figured out how to break this conflict. They are simultaneously delivering features at a rate we've never seen before, while providing, world-class stability and security. They figured out how to get both. So, when historians, I believe when historians talk about DevOps 10 years from now, they're going to say the starting gun of the DevOps movement happened in this talk. That was given by John Allspot and Paul Hammond at the Velocity Conference, which is one of my favorite conferences to go to. It's where organizations like Google, Etsy, Amazon, they all show off their engineering and ops chops. And so John Allspot was the head of operations for Flickr, and Paul Hammond was the director of engineering at Yahoo. And they gave a talk that really rocked the world, right? They said that, we are routinely doing 10 deploys a day, right, by having dev and ops working together. And even at Velocity, this was considered a high number. And had I been there, I was at the 2010 conference, I would have been like maybe you, right? I would have been the first jumping up in the aisleway saying that's immoral, that's reprehensible, that's reckless, right? You shouldn't do that. No reasonable person should do that. And yet, I genuinely believe that this is actually the direction that the world is going. This is going to be a critical differentiator and a critical capability for any organization. And so essentially what Allspot and Hammond were saying was that, dev and ops, there's a lot of reasons why they don't get along, right? Dev, they kind of embodied in Spock. Spock actually gets to sit on the bridge. Captain Kirk actually asks him for advice and will actually listen to him, right? Whereas Scotty's actually stuck in the basement. That's the embodiment of operations, right? He's always having to say no, right? The only time Captain Kirk calls is when, the warp engines are down. Scotty, we need warp speed. We can't do it, Captain. Damn it, I need warp speed now. And it just kind of shows the inherent elevation, that development has over operations. And by the way, where is information security? I think we're this guy, right? We're the first to get killed on the away team. So what they're saying was that we need ops people who can think like developers and developers who can think like ops people, right? And the result is not just a summer of torrid love, right? Now they're actually doing things that the world has never seen before, like 10 deploys a day. And by the way, Josh used a very interesting term, right? Boundary spanner. I think this is what Allspot and Hammond are talking about. People can actually span the boundaries between development and operations, and that's going to be critical, right, to get outcomes that are different than the ones that we're getting. There's a gentleman named Theo Schlossnagel. and again, this was the Velocity conference, he actually said, DevOps is actually an incomplete, crappy term, right? He said, it's not DevOps, right? It's actually he called it star ops, or more pedantically, right, star ops. And actually that's not quite true either. It's like every department ops. Where is network engineering? Where is QA? Where is information security? And the reason why I show this is that, Josh asserted to me very early, he's like, wow, that's an indication that the DevOps community is waiting for information security with open arms, right? They are waiting for us to contribute, and I think this is one of the best embodiments of that, right? It is a culture that is so consistent with our values, right? And so, I genuinely believe that, and every interaction I've had with the DevOps community, I think, just validates this even further. So one of the things I found in my journey studying high performers is that the high performers always accelerate away from the herd, right? The best get better, right? So in 2009, 10 deploys a day was considered fast. That's not so fast anymore. Amazon has gone on record last year saying that they're not doing 10 deploys a day. They're doing one deploy every 10 seconds, 11 seconds, right? So that's a mean number of deploys a day of 23,000 per day, right? So that could be as small as as a content change. It could be as large as a rollout of thousands of new environments, right? 23,000 deploys a day. And just to show you how dumb I am, I've been studying this space for 4 years. And I used to think that meant 23,000 feature releases per day, right? And that's not quite true. I think the two terms that are often conflated are deploys and releases, right? So what's happening here is that they are constantly migrating features and environments into production, right? Often in a disabled state, right? So I think about it like Operation Desert Shield, right? That was a 1 year set of deployments where men and materials were being staged into the live production environment, but there was one release, right? So, deploys and releases are different, but what a game changer that is. It means that we are now decoupling deployment risk with release risk, right? Now as Dev and Ops and Information Security, our job is to get features into deployment, right, into the production environment. Now release risk is all about marketing, right? Like, did the feature, when it's released, achieve the goals, that the business set out to do? We just a couple weeks ago, we actually concluded I worked with Puppet Labs to design the DevOps Survey of Practice, and we found 4,200 completed surveys, and we're finding that the high-performing DevOps organizations are deploying code 30 times more frequently and 8,000 times faster rate than their peers, right? So that really means deploying daily as opposed to monthly or quarterly, right? And they have twice the change success rate, and they can restore service 12 times as often, right? So we're seeing the same patterns that we did in the previous 13 years of research. High performers are getting better, and an interesting little data point here is that 68% of the 4,200 organizations that completed the study said that they're doing DevOps patterns, right? So it's not just the unicorns of Google, Amazon, Netflix, Etsy, right? It's also financial services like BNY Mellon, Bank of America, Intuit. It's even retailers like The Gap and GameStop. It's higher education. So if you have any organization that you've heard of or that are doing DevOps, please let me know. I'm sort of creating a catalog of the people who are doing these things because I think it's important. It's not just for the unicorns, it's for us horses too. So any comments or questions before I go into kind of the prescriptive steps of what I believe actually constitutes the DevOps set of patterns? Questions, comments, concerns? How am I doing here so far? Thumbs up? Resonating with you? Okay. Can I ask why? Oh, awesome. Cool. Great. But this is relevant to us? Yes? Okay. All right, so in the Phoenix project that we came out in January, there's a Yoda, Mr. Miyagi-like character, right, who kind of spoke in a kind of a gnomic, mysterious way, and would talk in the language of the three ways. So I'm going to actually go through the three ways, which are sort of the three sets of principles of which I believe you can actually derive all the DevOps patterns from, right? So the first way is all about systems thinking as we go from left to right, from development into operations, right? And so why Dev and Ops? Because Dev and Ops are what's between the business and the customer, right? So the business says, here's where we need to go. That gets translated into requirements that go into work in dev, right? That has to successfully transition into service, right? Into operations. And until it's actually running in production stably and securely, right? We actually haven't delivered value to the customer, Right, so the principles or even the platitudes that underpin the first way include understanding the flow of work, right? Work should only flow one way, right? And it should flow quickly, right? And by the way, when I say it should only flow one way, what it should not do, right, is go backwards, right? And often as information security people, right, we will not only stop the flow of work, we'll actually make the work rewind all the way back, right? At the end of a project, we add, 9 more months to the project, right? That's kind of a violation of the way work should be flowing. Because the goal is always to increase the flow of work. One of the things that we want to do in the Phoenix project book is we want to make an isomorphic mapping between IT operations and information security and the plant floor, right? And we thought that was important because if we could do that, then we could use 50, 60 years of the body of knowledge around how to increase flow in manufacturing, right? Whether it's Lean, Six Sigma, theory of constraints, right? And when you want to increase flow. And by the way, DevOps practitioners, they like to talk about deploys per day, right? A Lean practitioner would actually talk about like cycle time. How long does it actually take for, to go from code commit to running in production, right? And what is the lead time? And you can never get sort of like great cycle times until we never consciously pass defects downstream, right? And we can never actually do that until we kind of say, all right, the goal is not to make dev ship more features or QA increase their find fix rates or operations have perfect uptime. The goal is to achieve the global goals. And then once we do that, that's what Deming would call achieving profound appreciation of the system. Right. So what are the patterns that we can derive from the first way? I think the first one is our desire to visualize work. In the Lean community, one of the highest, best things that can happen is that work is visualized, right? Whether it's through Kanban boards or whatever. But the problem for operations and for information security is like, okay, before we visualize it, how do we even categorize it? Ben Rockwood, he's the director of systems engineering at Joint and a thought leader in the DevOps community. He said, participating in annual business planning sessions can be maddening because they think IT operations is an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? They come up with all these ideas, right, but they can't quite see that there's a capacity limit in operations. And so one of the patterns that he took out that he found immediately useful was, categorize the 4 categories of work. The first one is the business projects, like we need a new order entry system, we need some capability we need to get to the market for customers. That one's typically pretty easy because they get tracked in a project management office. But this one often isn't, right, is that those projects often get atomized into internal IT projects, right, whether it's, getting up a new database or, getting automation in place or increasing monitoring. So those typically aren't tracked anywhere, right, and that creates a problem if you want to do real sort of, if you actually want to know how much capacity you have inside of IT. Those things also get atomized into changes, right? So those typically live in the ticketing system, so that's not so hard. But then, there's the dark matter, unplanned work, right? Unplanned work is, whenever you have a site impairment, site down, you have auditors showing up, you have findings being generated. The reason why we call that sort of dark matter is that this can actually displace all the other types of work, right? Most organizations I've seen are spending 30, 40, 50% of their time on unplanned work, right? I've seen organizations actually spending 110% of the cycles on unplanned work, which means none of the other commitments are getting done, right? And so information security, by the way, technical debt also compounds unplanned work. Information security, right? So many of our aspirations and dreams are made impossible because the organization can't get out of unplanned work, right? We can't get out of the technical debt that we've created for ourselves. So I think the key takeaway here is measure unplanned work, right? Because it matters, because it displaces everything else. And then, measure this, right? Make sure that we're making enough time for internal IT projects. And this is where, operations improvement projects come from. So questions, comments on this before I go to the second one? Okay. So, hey, quick question. Just as a little internal benchmark, think of a friend, in an IT organization, and ask the question: how long does it take that person to go from code committed to code success? From code committed to tested to production ready to in deployment, right? In production. How many people would say that's measured in minutes? Raise your hand. Days? Weeks? Months? Quarters for your friend? Yeah. So I've seen organizations, I would say it's in 2 categories, right? The best in class is measured in minutes, right? I've seen organizations where it takes even 6 weeks to get a test environment, right? And when it takes that long to get a test environment, a black market emerges, right? It's like people actually hoard test environments, and it'll be like Corporal Klinger and MASH. It's like, you need a test environment? I've got one for you, right? How many do you need, right? I have one that's a little bit old, but I can get to you faster than the people in production, right? So that's one of the biggest bottlenecks, I think, in most organizations. How quickly can you get an environment? And then I would say, just as a proof point that you can actually go from quarters down to minutes, is of that time, how much of that time is spent in work versus in queue? Right, so in work means the machine is running, people are typing, right? We're waiting for an operation to complete. Versus in queue, which means it's sitting in a ticketing system somewhere, it's sitting in someone's mailbox, right? And you have to go bug that person, right, to actually execute a specific task, right? And what I found is that in most organizations, 99% plus is spent in queue, right? And so if you can tackle that, that's where you're going to find the most dramatic improvements, in cycle time, for that element of cycle time. Okay, so the second pattern that can be derived comes from this, right, is that when you're in a project management meeting and someone in marketing or development says, let's deploy next week, right, of which then InfoSec and Ops freak out, say, deploy that? That's not even designed to run, right? How can you even think about deploying that into production, right? And yet a commitment's been made and we have to go. The problem is that often leads to catastrophic release failures, right? In fact, to the point where we often have learned behaviors to clear the week, right, that you have a deployment because the releases have gone so badly in the past. And we believe one of the root causes for this is that of this failure is because the first time the code actually runs in the environment is during the release, right? In other words, they actually never worked together, right, until the point of execution. So the countermeasure here is that we have to hold operations responsible for being able to make an environment available on demand long before the project starts, right? And that should be executed in one step, right? Whether it's right-clicking, in Virtual Center, whether it's actually running, a Puppet or Chef script, right? The goal is so that developers can actually run their code, in an environment that resembles production, and that we can build the dev, test, and the production environments all at the same time, right? So now we have a synchronized environment. So I'll tell you that maybe about 6-7 years ago, I hated Agile, right? I thought they were a bunch of reckless idiots, right? Because, I saw the downstream effects. It was just a way to get crappy code quicker, right? But, actually, I now believe that they were really onto something, right? Because what I think in every body of knowledge around process improvement, one of the core tenets is large batch sizes kill, right? If you want to get to fast flow, you have to get to single piece flow, small batch sizes. So the whole idea of waterfall methods, right, is actually, profoundly flawed. So there's actually something really great when you have Agile practitioners saying, we want shippable code at the end of each release. But we know that's not sufficient, right, because we've seen the outcomes. There's a minor modification that if we can make could really change outcomes in a great way, is that if we can just change the tenet to say, at the end of each sprint, we not only have shippable code, but we have shippable code that runs in an environment that resembles production, right? And if we do that, that actually radically changes outcomes, right? Because by the time we get to the big release, we've actually executed the integration between code and the environment, tens or even hundreds of times, right? How am I doing? Is this making sense? Yep. And by the way, what a great place for information security to be in, right? It's like now we have a standardized build. We have a place where we can actually enforce configuration variants, right? This is great for ops, great for dev, and also great for security. I'm going to share with you just one finding that we kind of discovered about a month ago. In this DevOps Survey of practice, we found that there were, in these 4,200 organizations, there were 2 practices that showed up universally in every high performer, and it was almost universally absent in every medium and low performer. And those 2 things are, do they have the environment and all the artifacts checked into version control, right? Ideally in the same repo as development. And the second one is there an automated process for creating an environment, right? Those 2 things, have an incredibly high predictor of performance, right? So if there's 2 things that you want to think about doing, right, is, how can you get some sort of automated way to create deployments for production, dev, and test, and make sure those are checked into version control. Because, when you have environments and code living in the same repository, that too creates like this cultural flow of communication, right? Because now we have kind of mutual visibility into each other's work. And it's great for security, right? Because now we have traceability. So the outcomes of the first way, by putting these kind of patterns into place, is now we have ideally a single point of inspection, right, and one route to production through the source code repositories. We have determinism in the release process, right, that we've never been able to achieve before. We have consistent dev, test, and production environments, right, that are all properly built long before the deployment begins. We can actually in order to get to high deploy rates, we have a continuous delivery pipeline where we can actually put automated tests into. I'll talk more about that later. And this is what decreases cycle time, right? One of the experiences that had a tremendous influence on me was a project I was doing with the CTO of AOL for the AOL.com homepage. Just by changing who was doing the packaging, right, we took down the deployment time from 6 hours to 45 minutes, right? So in the old way, the developers would take all the WAR files, put them in a network share, and go home, right? And the ops people and security people would have to sort of pick through the, the refuse and try to, come up with an installer for it. When the QA people took that over, right, I mean, just doing that one thing, took deployments down from 6 hours to 45 minutes. So the reason why that made such an impact on me is that what I learned out of it was that small changes can have radically great outcomes, right? This doesn't have to be this mega project, right? This could be just small things about, who does what. And it's great for ops, great for dev, and also great for security. And then by decreasing cycle time, that's how we get to faster release cadences. You go from one deploy every, 3 quarters to once a month, to once a week, to on demand. Any comments, questions on that before we go to the second way? Questions, comments? All right. Okay, so the first way was all about the left to right flow of work as we go from dev to ops. The second way is reciprocal. How do we take the learnings that we learned at the very end of the value stream and then bring it to the very front, right? How do we create those feedback loops so that we can actually prevent bad things from happening again, or if we can't prevent it, ideally be able to more quickly detect and correct. So the principles or platitudes that underpin the second way are understanding, responding to the needs of all customers, internal and external. So I think we're all very good as a community saying, hey, the end customer, is the person behind the browser or the person in the business. But according to the lean school of thought, the more important customer is the internal customer, as defined by the next downstream step, right? As defined by the next downstream work center. And the reason why is that we want to optimize all our work so it makes work easiest for them. Right, and the reason why we want to do that is because we want to shorten and amplify all the feedback loops. So I think that the ultimate example of this is the Toyota Andon cord. So in a Toyota plant, above every work center is a cord that if any operation takes longer than documented, you actually are expected to pull the cord, and that stops all of production, right? The trucks don't actually come out the other side. How many people here, can anyone guess how many times the Andon cord is pulled on a given day? Just how many times in a given day? Order of magnitude. 0. Good guess? Higher. 5? Higher. 10? Higher. I used to think 100, right? And that was a big number, right? Someone actually sent me a link that said, no, for the plant in Tennessee, they actually pull it 3,300 times a day. Right? So, which is astonishing for a whole bunch of reasons, right? One is like, why would they do that, right? And I think it's because that they believe that it is better to fix the problem now, right? Don't allow any more work into the system until we fix that, because if we don't, then we will allow technical debt to accrue downstream, right? So I guess, the question I have for you guys, right, is like, in any given day, how many things do you see on any given day where you think this isn't quite going according to plan, right? Maybe the best thing that we can do is, stop production. And this is not so alien to development, right? In many development shops, if someone breaks the build, they don't actually allow any more check-ins until they fix the build, right? Someone breaks a unit test, no more check-ins until we fix the unit test, right? So this is just a minor extension to something that you already see in, many dev organizations and certainly in any DevOps organization. Yeah?
I've never thought of this before, but Toyota has had more major vehicle recalls in the last 3 or 4 years than any car manufacturer has. And what you say, I'm not a proponent of this, but I'm wondering if maybe there's some problem that their process doesn't see. This process doesn't see. They just recall like 2 million cars.
There's a... Yeah, there's a whole body of literature around kind of the study of that, and one of the things that they talk about is actually part of the third way. Is like, you know, they identified the root cause as not having enough coaches, you know, that where they should have been able to spot this earlier in the process as a result of growth. And if you want to talk about this more offline, I'll be around tonight over drinks. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. So the goal is to create quality at the source, right? And you know, I think one of the best examples of this was also in the 1980s, where around this body of knowledge called design for manufacturing, where plant engineers realized their end customer isn't the person driving the cars, it's the people on the assembly line, right? How do we make it impossible for them to over-tighten screws or put parts on backwards? And that's where you ended up with wildly asymmetrical pieces, right? And that fixed not only defect rates, but it also increased flow, right? And we can only do things like that if we create and embed knowledge where we need it. So what are the DevOps patterns, you know, that we can actually derive from these? This is one of my favorite quotes from a gentleman named Patrick Lightbody. He was a founder of a company called Browser Mob. So it was one of the first companies that did sort of massive load testing in the cloud. If you need 5,000 browser instances, you know, you just spin them up. He said, we found that when we woke up developers at 2 a.m., defects got fixed faster than ever. Right? And the goal here is not to wake up developers maliciously, right? It's to make sure that they share the pain, right? That they can see the consequences of decisions they're making on a daily basis, right? And the faster that feedback loop is, right, typically, the faster the fix, right? And so one of the best examples for this, I think, on large scale is Google. So this is a guy named Tom Limoncelli. He's describing the handoff process at Google. So they have a very interesting constraint. You know, for them, the most scarce talent they have is